Hi, this is Hickey with the Lost Samba podcast. Beleza? Today we're going to speak about the ugly duckling of the bossa nova, or the wronged star of the bossa nova, or the father of the bossa nova. Whichever pick you do, one thing you can't do is to negate the talent and the genius of the one and only Johnny Alf. When I was growing up, my parents used to tell me that when they arrived in Brazil in the 1950s, women wouldn't be seen in Rio's nights, not even with their husbands, in restaurants. It was a male dominated country. So I would ask myself, so where is the fun? Where did, Rio has a reputation of being a fun town. Where did the guys go to have fun? The answer came back a few years later when I grew older, and it was the Inferninhos, or the small hells. That's the translation. Copacabana was filled with them. You had one almost on every block. Some were more concentrated near the Rua do Vivier in Copacabana, where later on the Beco das Garrafas, that's considered, but we'll see that it's not, the birthplace of Bossa Nova. These places ranged from loungy jazz clubs, almost loungy jazz, though always a little naughty element in there, to downright strip joints and places where you did encounters of with professionals of the trade. Later on, these Inferninhos would nowadays they still exist. A few of them have survived all of this time, but they got a very promiscuous aura, and they degenerated to that. Well, nothing against them. I'm not like on a moral crusade here. It's just to let people know what happened to the Inferninhos. Anyway, this was where the male youth, the Carioca male youth, especially the one of Copacabana, spent their nights, and according to all reports, they were very good nights. They usually ended in the early hours, and it was quite common for you to go back home, walking back by the beach after spending the night in an Inferninho. That's one of the cool things of the night in Rio. You go to a nightclub or something, you leave, and then you just go to the beach. Sometimes you can even kind of take off your shirt or all your clothes if you want, and you just go into the sea, and then you go back home walking by the beach. It's very good, and people used to do that, and you'd meet famous actors, politicians, millionaires, celebrities doing the same as you did, and the night in Copacabana and in Ipanema, but mainly the fun in the 50s was in Copacabana, was very, very, very good. Our Johnny Alf was one of the main musical exponents, or the main musical exponents at some point of that night scene in Copacabana. Alfredo José da Silva, his real name, was one of the very few people in Brazil to have lost a father in a civil war. There was a civil war between São Paulo and the government that was based in Rio, and he was left fatherless child, and he was brought up by his mother in poverty. They lived in Santo André in São Paulo, and they came to the capital of Brazil that time, Rio de Janeiro, and she found a job as a domestic servant in a household in Tijuca. As sometimes was the custom in those days, the mother brought Alfredo to live with her in the job. And as also was the custom in those days, the family took a liking to the boy, a very clever, very well-behaved boy, and very musical. They had a piano in the house. He was the whole time on the piano trying to learn it. So when he was around the age of 9, they came to an agreement with him that if he passed the exams, the entry exams to one of the good schools of the neighborhood, they would pay piano lessons for him. And that's how he studied piano, classical piano, for 8 years with a very good teacher, and became a quite accomplished classical piano player. He played all the classics, Chopin, Beethoven, everything you can think about, Debussy. He became a great pianist, which obviously would help him in his career. Don't ask me how, but he ended up being part of a musical appreciation group or a musical society as a teenager in the Institute Brasil USA, the IBIU, Instituto Brasil Estados Unidos, in Copacabana, which was close to where I lived at the time. There he met a lot of expat kids, more or less his age, and he obviously showed off his talents to them, as it was a musical society, and he not only impressed, but he charmed the whole group because of his unlikely background and his unlikely talent, and also he was a very educated and easy to be around person. So he ended up being the center of attention with this group filled with foreigners for him. These were Americans in the United States. And in this group, he learned, or he got in contact because of his friends, with American jazz, and he went deep into it. He asked his teacher, his piano teacher, to learn it. And she said, okay, if you get the classical things, I'll teach you the jazz. So he also learned jazz, and he became also an accomplished jazz piano player at a very early age. And as is the case with any musician, and the musicians who watch this will know, when you play well, or you have an instant perception that people are enjoying what you're playing, and this makes you play even better. So this was probably the case with Johnny Alfie. The more he played, the better he played, the more the people liked him, and it gives you a buzz that's very difficult to replace in any other way. His next step in this world that he had joined, this American Carioca world, this expat world, was to join the Frank Sinatra Dick Funny Appreciation Society. Now, Frank Sinatra, everybody knows. Dick Funny was a crooner.
Copacabana, o mar, eterno canto. Ao te beijar, ficou perdido de amor. E hoje vivo a murmurar.
Who sang the kind of songs Johnny and his group liked. So he was a carioca singing jazz, a bit like Nat King Cole. And he was already a famous guy in Brazil. He lived a while in the States as a crooner, but he was one of the main crooners of these Inferninhos. Dick Farney used to go to the group sometimes to see them play his songs, to see them play Frank Sinatra, and he was very impressed by Alfredo at the time, and he offered him his first job. He convinced a nightclub that was needing a pianist to audition this boy, and Johnny Alfie got his first gig, and he never looked back. The name Johnny came when he was interviewing for the job, and to you know what name they were going to put for their attraction, and the group only called him Alfie. Someone in the group suggested, why don't you put Johnny? So that became his artistic name that followed him also the rest of his life, Johnny Alfie. Now we skip a few years, and Alfredo, or Johnny, as you wish, he is one of the big stars of the Carioca night scene, or more specifically Copacabana's night scene. It was a different era, you know, there was not much to do, there was no internet, the television stopped early in the evening, and you could buy records, but it was a very restricted kind of life in terms of listening to music and culture and going out and meeting people. Anyway, so many Copacabana teenagers would kind of sneak out to watch Johnny Alfie because he was one of the sensations. He had he played piano very well, and he also had this weird mixture of samba and jazz. So some of these teenagers became heavyweights in the bossa nova. So we're talking about Roberto Menescal, Silvia Telles, and Carlinhos Lira. They definitely used to sneak out of their flats to watch Johnny Alfie. On the other side of the street, there was also another young pianist who also played more or less the same kind of music. A guy called Antônio Carlos Jobim, or Tom Jobim, who became like a huge name. And both of them became very close friends. They'd watch each other's gigs, and it's difficult to say who influenced who. One thing one has to say is that Johnny definitely played piano better than Tom Jobim, and he had a better voice than Tom Jobim, and differently to Tom Jobim, he wrote the lyrics and the melodies of his songs. As his fame grew, he became friends with all these youngsters, but also with other people, famous artists, or good artists. And one of them was João Gilberto, who was happening in Rio and who became like the guitar guy to go to when you spoke about bossa nova. They both became very close friends. And João Gilberto would record several of his songs throughout his career, and also he had a great respect for Johnny Alfie, because anyone who plays music would have had that. As in any musical movement, things got bigger, the dynamics changed. João Gilberto recorded the groundbreaking album with a hit, Chega de Saudade, that made the bossa nova explode throughout the country. Bossa nova became like a commercial music no one could get enough of throughout the country. It would influence the people of the Tropicalia, like a whole generation was listened to throughout Brazil. It really sounded different because it brought these jazz elements into the samba. It modernized Brazilian music in a big way. You know, before you only had the sambas or crooners singing in an operatic voice, and this made this gave a different dynamic to Brazilian music, and also it was a reflection of a modernizing Brazil. We have a podcast that speaks about this. Johnny, or Alfredo, he didn't see himself really as a part of this movement. For him, it was like a commercial trickery, and he had already launched a few albums. They weren't very successful because they're too jazzy and difficult to understand. So he didn't really want to be labeled as a bossa nova artist. For him, he was a jazz musician who sang in a different way. So he kind of stayed doing what he had always done. In this situation where bossa nova was successful, commercially interesting, an episode happened where it defined Johnny Alfe's career, so to speak, or his break from the bossa nova. This was when, in 1962, there was a concert in the Carnegie Hall, and the idea of this concert was to bring the bossa nova to the United States. It already had a respectable following, but they wanted to make it big. So much so, it had such a following that when the plane arrived with all these bossa nova artists, there was a committee of American artists, some very known artists like Dean Martin and others. Doesn't come to my head now, but there was a committee. It was a big occasion. The bossa nova guys are coming to play in New York. Everybody was there except for Johnny Alfe. There's a lot of controversy about this. Some people will say he didn't want to go because he didn't see himself as part of the bossa nova. However, people close to him and close to the production of this event say that the guy who was organizing it didn't want a poor black and gay artist to obfuscate Tom Jobim, he played kind of the same music. He was white, he was heterosexual, he was very good looking. So to have a pianist better than him, who sang better than him, would make bossa nova less commercial, if you will, or it would sell less. So the person organizing this event, he went to the authorities and made them refuse to give a passport to Johnny Alfe, who missed the opportunity and who obviously wasn't happy with what happened. And in this mix, bossa nova made it big in the United States, or made it bigger than it even was before. It consolidated bossa nova, and Johnny Alfe was left out. Although they never talked about it, you won't see any interview of the bossa nova big people mentioning this incident. It's very unlikely that they were the ones motivating this exclusion of Johnny Alfe. But it is very likely that the people in charge of promoting bossa nova did this. One of the circumstantial proofs about this is that Alaide Costa, who was a great singer, like better than any other bossa nova singer.
Eu acho graça do meu pensamento a conduzir o nosso amor discreto.
Bossa nova forte is definitely not the singing. She was also excluded, and she was equally poor and black. So you take your conclusions. The fact that he had an alcohol problem didn't help. It must be said that the promoters of Brazilian music abroad never had a problem with Jorge Ben, nor who is black, with Sergio Mendes, who is mixed race but would be considered black in many quarters. And Sergio Mendes was part of this presentation in the Carnegie Hall. So the racism allegation perhaps doesn't stick. It is true that other black artists did suffer racism, as is the case of Luis Melodia and Itamar Assunção. He's not so known, but both of them clearly suffered racism. Milton Nascimento had a lot of things in common with Johnny Alfe. I won't go into it, but you can take your conclusions. He was an adopted boy, right? He grew up in a family, but this was in the interior of Minas Gerais. It's less brutal than in Rio. These issues of sexuality and race. He flirted with bossa nova for a while in the beginning of his career. His career succeeded independent of anything of the bossa nova. Gilberto Gil, obviously, he was part of the Tropicalia, very well accepted, never, as far as I know, suffered racism, but there was obviously a bias against Afro-Brazilians, because it's very strange that such a popular genre based on samba and on jazz, which both came from Africa, and in Brazil, that is a multicultural society, the fact that there was no Afro-Brazilian mixed in the top echelons of bossa nova, it indicates a certain bias. It's also must be said that all the bossa nova guys, they had a reverence for Afro-Brazilian culture. One of the main ideas of bossa nova was to create Brazilian culture, and for them Brazilian culture would have to include the Afro influence, but you don't encounter Afro-Brazilians in the top echelons. As far as homophobia is concerned, that's certainly something that Johnny Alfie had to keep well coveted if he wanted to expand commercially, and his songs, many of his songs, are almost explicitly gay, so that probably was something that created a certain rejection. Later on, homosexuality became much more accepted and much more normalized in Brazilian culture. You know, in the 70s there was Secos e Molhados with Ney Matogrosso.
Os ventos do norte não movem e o que me resta é só gemido. Minha vida, meus mortos, meus caminhos tortos.
Showing like homoerotic poses and dressing himself like a woman and singing like a woman, so he was like, even worldwide, it was like groundbreaking, someone so openly gay on the stages playing on the radio. Later on there was Cazuza, who was also openly gay, and his songs were about gay themes. And they were actually a couple for a while, Ney Matogrosso and Cazuza, although of different generations. So it became more acceptable. Johnny Alfie wasn't that lucky. In his generation, it was like a taboo subject, not justifying, but he was someone difficult to bring into mainstream. He was okay for the nightlife, for the nightclubs, for the inferninhos, but I guess, right? It was difficult for a manager to make him become mainstream. One thing worthwhile mentioning is that he almost had an international career saver. When Ella Fitzgerald came to Brazil, Ella Fitzgerald was a big bossa nova lover, and she invited Johnny Alfie to do a tour of the United States with him. That would probably become a world tour. She wanted to promote him, and Johnny went to a Mãe de Santo, which is more or less a priestess in the Candomblé, in the Afro-Brazilian religion, and she said that it would be a bad idea, wouldn't be good for him, so he refused to go, which Anyway, you take the conclusions that you will. But he refused an international tour with Ella Fitzgerald, one of the big names of jazz, based on what Mãe de Santo said. Johnny stayed playing until a quite advanced stage. He's always in nightclubs. He moved to São Paulo. He was a respected name by everybody. As I said, João Gilberto, Caetano Veloso recorded Johnny Alf's songs. Other less notorious artists also. But he ended up in relative obscurity, and he died poor. Life sometimes isn't that generous for people who are very different. The song I'm going to play today, for me, as a musician, as someone who plays bossa nova and other styles, demonstrates big sophistication in Johnny Alf's songwriting. He was really, playing Tom Jobim, playing Vinícius, playing Chico Buarque, and playing Johnny Alf. He stands out by the creativity of his songwriting. It's a very romantic song with it's homoerotic almost. It's not explicit, but as many of his songs, it's there. And it's a very complex, harmonically it's very complex, but it works fantastically, better than most of the other bossa novas that I play, which are also very complex, but it's more or less they don't exploit it in the same way that Johnny Alf did. It's very, very evolved and very creative and excellent, as you'll see, and I hope you like. Se a juventude que essa brisa canta ficasse aqui comigo mais um pouco, eu poderia esquecer a dor de ser tão só, pra ser um sonho. Então, quem sabe alguém chegasse trazendo um sonho em forma de desejo, felicidade então pra nós seria. E depois que a tarde nos trouxesse a lua, se amor chegasse eu não resistiria, e a madrugada acalentaria a nossa paz. Fica, ó brisa fica, pois talvez, quem sabe, o inesperado traga uma surpresa e traga alguém que queira me escutar. E junto a mim queira ficar. E junto a mim queira ficar. Today's quirk about the song, about Johnny Alf, about his history, I'll speak about the experiences of having maids. That's more or less his background, this tension or this relationship between patroas, as they say, the housewives and the maids. It was always a very complex one. So many households, perhaps it's even an inheritance of the slavery days, which Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in the world. It was still there at 1888, which is quite modern. So many houses, they kind of patronize their maids. in a good way. So I know cases of people who bought a house for their maid, or as in the case of Johnny Alfie, they invested in the maid's education, and the maid for the children became almost like a second mother, which was the case in my upbringing. We've always had maids, and at least one of them had very strong attachments to her. Georgie Maltner, who we spoke about in another podcast, his nanny was from the favela, and if it weren't for her, he wouldn't have been Georgie Maltner. He wouldn't have had this understanding of the Afro culture. It's not in my case. The maid was also in the Umbanda, but it gave me a proximity to Brazilian culture which I would never had if it were not her. But one incident that really is an eye-opener also of how this worked was that there was this one maid when I was a kid that she used to bring her son to go to work. My mom didn't want another child in the house. It was me and my sister, so she'd bring in her child and she'd hide him there. So I was the only person in the family who knew he was there, so I'd play with him and everything. But when my mom arrived, he would hide behind the curtain. And I found that strange, why are you hiding and everything. And one day she found him out. She opened the curtain, the boy was there, and she went to the kitchen and yelled at the maid and fired her, which was pretty traumatic. And the whole building supported her. They didn't support the maid, they supported my mom. So it's a bit telling of what went on at the time in as far as race and social relationships went. Also, another quirk is that the bill where Johnny Alfie used to go was close to my house. At the time I started going to the bill. We had already moved to Ipanema, but I used to go there, and they had this library full of books and records, and it was very generous. So it's there where I had my encounter with Brazilian music, because it had many records. My parents wouldn't buy records of Brazilian music, so I'd get Brazilian records. So that's where I learned about the Novos Baianos. I used to hear everything that went out of the artists from the Northeast, like very traditional artists. So it opened my mind. I also got books of Jorge Amado there. So it helped me, and it helped Johnny Alfie. We are completely different, but I have this in common with Johnny Alfie. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast, and I hope to see you again next week. Até mais.